What if the world's greatest conqueror was shaped not by the sword, but by the mind of a philosopher? Imagine a young prince, restless, fierce, born to rule, yet guided by the wisdom of a man whose ideas still echo through classrooms today. One dreamed of uniting empires under his banner, the other dreamed of uniting thought under reason. But what happens when power and philosophy collide? When the ambition of Alexander the Great meets the wisdom of Aristotle? This is not just a story of battles and kingdoms. It's a hidden struggle between knowledge and conquest, between the teacher who sought truth and the student who sought the world. Did Aristotle truly shape Alexander into the unstoppable force we remember? Or was the conqueror always destined to rise, with or without the philosopher's hand? Stay with me, because the untold truth behind Alexander's education may shock you. A truth that reveals not only how empires were built, but how ideas can outlast even the sharpest blade. And if you think you already know the answer, think again. Subscribe, watch till the end, and let's uncover whether it was power or philosophy that truly changed history. The Prince and the Philosopher. The story begins not on the battlefield, but in the palace halls of Macedonia, long before Alexander would ever set foot in Asia. The boy who would become the conqueror of empires was not yet the roaring lion of history, but rather a curious child with sharp eyes, restless energy, and a spirit that seemed too vast for the walls that contained him. He was the son of King Philip II, a man of iron will and unmatched military brilliance, and Olympias, a mother as ambitious as she was mysterious. From birth, Alexander was destined for greatness, but greatness is not born ready. It must be shaped, tempered, sharpened like a blade before it cuts through history. And in this shaping, one figure stands above all others, the philosopher Aristotle. But was Aristotle truly the master behind Alexander's destiny, or merely a passing voice in the young prince's chaotic world? That question is what draws us deeper into a story both fascinating and contested. A story where the lines between teacher and pupil blur, where knowledge and ambition dance together in ways that would forever alter the fate of nations. Picture the palace courtyard in Pella, the Macedonian capital. A boy, no more than 13, grips a wooden spear, his arms straining to mimic the warriors he idolizes. Yet his father sees more than just a soldier in him. King Philip, cunning as ever, understands that an empire cannot be built by muscle alone. For empire demands vision, strategy, diplomacy, qualities forged not by the battlefield but by the mind. And so he summons one of the greatest thinkers of all time to tutor his son. Aristotle, student of Plato, heir to the intellectual traditions of Athens, is brought north to Macedonia, far from the academies of philosophy, to shape a boy into a king. But let us pause here and ask, why Aristotle? Why did Philip choose him above all others? The answer lies in ambition. Philip's eyes were already set beyond Greece. He dreamed of uniting the fractious city-states, of marching east into Persia. He knew his son would inherit not a throne of peace but of war. And for such a throne he needed more than a warrior. He needed a thinker who could command armies with ideas as much as with swords. Aristotle was not just a philosopher. He was a strategist, a natural scientist, a man who believed in logic, order, and observation. Who better to arm a prince with the invisible weapons of knowledge? Imagine their first meeting. The philosopher, robed and austere, perhaps skeptical of this fiery boy. The boy, impatient, his eyes flashing with questions that no ordinary tutor could satisfy. Did Alexander at first resent the lessons, longing for the thrill of battle instead? Or did he sense even then that the words of Aristotle would serve as secret weapons, hidden in the chambers of his mind, waiting to be unleashed on the world? History does not tell us the mood of their first encounter, but it does tell us the bond that grew between them would be unlike any other in history. Under Aristotle, Alexander's education was not limited to philosophy alone. He studied poetry, rhetoric, medicine, geography, and natural sciences. The boy devoured Homer's Iliad, not as mere literature but as a guidebook for life. In the hero Achilles, Alexander saw himself reflected, a warrior of destiny. He even carried a copy of the Iliad on his campaigns, annotated by Aristotle himself. But was it the philosopher's wisdom that inspired him, or his own insatiable hunger to live up to the myth of heroes? Therein lies the heart of our mystery. For centuries, storytellers have painted Aristotle as the master craftsman behind Alexander's brilliance. Yet others whisper that Alexander was too independent, too fiery to be molded by anyone. Did Aristotle truly instill in him the values of logic and balance? Or did Alexander twist those lessons into weapons of his own design? Consider this. Aristotle taught the importance of moderation, of reason guiding passion. Yet Alexander would go on to push beyond moderation, chasing conquest to the very edges of the known world. Did he abandon his teacher's wisdom, or did he reinterpret it, believing that reason itself demanded the pursuit of the limitless? Even as a boy, Alexander's curiosity could not be contained. He studied medicine so intently that on campaign he prescribed treatments for his soldiers. He mastered philosophy to such a degree that he could argue with scholars twice his age. He even explored zoology and geography, forever questioning the nature of the world. It is said that when he gazed upon the heavens he wept, not because he saw too little, but because he feared there were no more worlds left to conquer. Was this hunger Aristotle's gift, or a fire that no teacher could control? And so the prince grew. Each lesson from Aristotle left its mark, not as chains to restrain him, but as sparks to ignite his ambition. The more he learned, the more he desired. He would not be content to remain a Macedonian prince. He dreamed of Achilles, of empires, of immortality through conquest. And Aristotle, whether knowingly or not, had fanned these flames. But let us not forget, every teacher carries not only knowledge but also bias. Aristotle was no neutral mentor. He instilled in Alexander a love for Greek culture, a belief in Hellenic superiority. He taught that barbarians were lesser, that Greeks held a natural right to rule. Was it coincidence, then, that Alexander would go on to spread Greek culture across the lands he conquered, fusing East and West in what would later be called Hellenization? Or was this the invisible hand of Aristotle shaping the destiny of nations? Yet destiny is never so simple. For if Aristotle planted the seeds, Alexander chose how they grew. And here lies our cliffhanger. For though Aristotle gave him wisdom, it would not be philosophy alone that forged the conqueror. Soon the lessons would be tested by fire, on the battlefield, in the chaos of succession, in the moment when a boy would be forced to become a king. And when that moment came, would Aristotle's voice still echo in his mind? Or would Alexander abandon the philosopher's path to carve his own legend? The truth, as we shall see, is not so clear. The education of Alexander the Great was not a simple tale of teacher and pupil. It was a collision of ambition and philosophy, of power and wisdom, of destiny and free will. And as the story unfolds, you may find yourself wondering, was Aristotle the architect of empire, or merely a witness to a boy who needed no teacher to change the world? Part 1 ends here, with Alexander still a student, absorbing lessons that would either guide or haunt him for the rest of his life. But in Part 2 the stage will shift. A kingdom awaits. Battles will erupt. And the bond between philosopher and conqueror will face its first great test. From the classroom to the throne. The boy who once sat at Aristotle's feet would not remain a student for long. Lessons are powerful, but they are tested not in quiet chambers of philosophy, but in the storm of history. For Alexander, that storm came sooner than anyone could have imagined. The palace of Macedonia was no sanctuary. It was a battlefield of its own, where whispers cut sharper than daggers, and every alliance carried the shadow of betrayal. King Philip II, Alexander's father, was a man both admired and feared. A general of ruthless brilliance, Philip had turned Macedonia from a rough northern kingdom into a power that dominated Greece. But with power came enemies not just abroad but within his own family. Olympias, Alexander's mother, was fiercely protective of her son. She told him from childhood that his destiny was divine, that he was descended from Achilles, that the blood of gods flowed in his veins. Whether she truly believed this or merely used it to sharpen his ambition we may never know. But Alexander believed. And such belief, fused with Aristotle's philosophy, created a dangerous mixture. A prince who saw himself not only as heir to Macedonia but as heir to the entire world. And then came the moment that shattered the fragile order. In 336 BCE, Philip II was struck down, assassinated, his body collapsing at his daughter's wedding. Who held the dagger? Was it a bodyguard betrayed? A plot orchestrated by Olympias herself? Or a web of conspirators who feared Philip's rising power? History remains uncertain, the truth buried in shadows. But one fact is undeniable. The young Alexander, only 20 years old, suddenly found himself standing at the edge of destiny. The student of Aristotle had no more time for lessons. The boy was now king. What did Aristotle think of this moment? Did he believe his pupil was ready? Or did he fear that the fire within Alexander would burn too hot? We cannot know his private thoughts. What we do know is that the philosopher had given Alexander tools, reason, rhetoric, the knowledge of cultures, the wisdom of strategy. And now the young king would wield them not in theory, but in the cruel theater of politics and war. But ruling Macedonia was no simple task. Enemies circled like wolves. Greek city-states, long oppressed by Philip, sensed weakness and rebellion. Rivals within Macedonia whispered of coups. Persia, the great empire to the east, watched with interest. All eyes were on Alexander. Would this young man prove himself, or collapse under the weight of his father's legacy? Here Aristotle's lessons may have saved him. The philosopher had taught him persuasion, the art of winning loyalty not just through fear, but through charisma and reason. When rebellion flared in Thebes, Alexander acted not like an uncertain boy but like a seasoned commander. He marched his army with lightning speed, catching the rebels off guard. Thebes, proud and defiant, fell within days. Its walls were destroyed, its people scattered. The message was clear: the boy king was no boy at all. He was ruthless, decisive, unyielding. But was this Aristotle's moderation? Or was it Achilles reborn, a warrior fueled by glory? Did Alexander act with philosophical balance, or with the unrestrained hunger for dominance that no teacher could tame? The line blurred as it would time and again. Yet the connection to Aristotle remained. Even as he crushed Thebes, Alexander carried with him the intellectual tools his teacher had given him. He did not simply destroy, he used the fall of Thebes as a symbol, a lesson to Greece that resistance was futile. This was more than brute force. This was strategy woven with narrative, philosophy applied to power. It was Aristotle's logic fused with Alexander's will. But Aristotle was not always pleased. As Alexander's ambitions grew, he began to see his former pupil moving beyond philosophy into myth. The young king declared himself son of Zeus Ammon, a living god. To Aristotle, who believed in rational order, this was dangerous arrogance. Was Alexander still listening to his teacher's wisdom, or had he begun to craft his own mythology, one that no logic could restrain? The tension between the philosopher and the conqueror deepened. At times they clashed bitterly. Aristotle favored Greek superiority, teaching that non-Greeks were barbarians destined to be ruled. Alexander, however, began to see the world differently. As he marched east, he adopted Persian customs, married foreign wives, and encouraged his men to blend with the cultures they conquered. To Aristotle this was betrayal. To Alexander it was vision. Was this divergence proof that the student had surpassed the teacher? Or was it a dangerous sign that he had abandoned reason for glory? The answer, perhaps, lies in Alexander's campaigns. When he faced the mighty Persian Empire, the test was not simply of swords, but of strategy, diplomacy, and endurance. At the Battle of Granicus, when his army crossed into Asia Minor, Alexander showed not only courage but also cunning. He arranged his forces with precision, using tactics that echoed the logical structures he had studied in Aristotle's lessons. Victory was swift, shocking the world. But more battles awaited. At Issus he faced King Darius III himself. Outnumbered, surrounded, Alexander did the unthinkable. He led a direct cavalry charge straight at Darius, breaking the Persian line and forcing the great king to flee. It was bold. It was reckless. It was genius. But was it philosophy, or pure instinct? Perhaps both. For in Alexander, the philosopher and the warrior lived side by side. One moment he was Achilles, charging into battle with fury. The next he was Aristotle's pupil, reorganizing cities, spreading Greek culture, founding Alexandria, a beacon of learning and commerce. He was both conqueror and student, blending reason with ambition in ways the world had never seen. Yet in this duality lay a tragedy. For while Aristotle's voice may have whispered caution, Alexander's hunger drowned it out. Moderation, balance, limits, these were chains to him. He sought the edge of the world, the limits of existence itself. No teacher could restrain such a soul. And so, as Alexander pressed further into Asia, the distance between him and Aristotle grew. Letters were exchanged, but tension lingered. The philosopher who once shaped the boy could no longer guide the man. The conqueror was beyond teaching. Still, the shadow of Aristotle remained. His influence can be seen in Alexander's fascination with knowledge. Wherever he marched, he brought scientists, historians, geographers, men tasked with studying the lands he conquered. This was no mere conqueror. This was a man who saw empire as both battlefield and classroom. Ideas traveled with him as surely as armies. And that, perhaps, was Aristotle's greatest legacy within him, the belief that knowledge was as vital as the sword. But destiny is cruel. As Alexander's star rose, tragedy followed. He grew suspicious, paranoid, his own friends falling to accusations of betrayal. Was this the logical ruler Aristotle envisioned? Or a man undone by his own unchecked ambition? The line between teacher and student had long been crossed. What began as education had transformed into conflict, between the ideals of philosophy and the reality of power. And as Alexander pressed toward the heart of Persia, the question grew louder. Was he still Aristotle's pupil, or had he become something far greater and far more dangerous? The Empire of Conquest and the Shadow of Philosophy. The year is 331 BCE. The dust of countless battles lingers in the air. The young Macedonian king, barely past his 20s, now stands against the most powerful empire of his age, the Achaemenid Persians. His armies have marched across Asia Minor, toppled cities and scattered enemies. Yet the ultimate test lies ahead, a confrontation with King Darius III, ruler of Persia, master of an empire stretching from the Mediterranean to the Indus. Here, Alexander's education becomes both a weapon and a burden. For while his sword will decide the fate of nations, it is his mind, trained by Aristotle, that crafts the strategies leading him to victory. Aristotle had taught him observation, the careful study of nature and patterns. And Alexander applied this not only to philosophy but to war itself. He studied terrain as if it were a text, dissected enemy formations like arguments in logic, and countered weaknesses as though debating an opponent. The Battle of Gaugamela stands as his masterpiece. Darius's forces dwarfed Alexander's, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, war elephants, scythed chariots gleaming beneath the Persian sun. The outcome seemed inevitable. Yet Alexander, calm and analytical, surveyed the battlefield with a philosopher's eye. He positioned his forces with precision, stretched the Persian lines thin, and at the decisive moment, led a daring cavalry wedge straight at Darius himself. The great king fled once more. Persia collapsed. The impossible had been achieved. Alexander, student of Aristotle, had toppled an empire that had stood for centuries. But now comes the question, was this truly Aristotle's influence, or had Alexander transcended the philosopher's teaching? Aristotle spoke of moderation, of balance in all things. Yet Alexander now pursued not balance but infinity. He was no longer content with ruling Greece, no longer content with victory at Issus or Granicus. Even the fall of Persia was not enough. He dreamed of the horizon itself, of reaching the edges of the world where the oceans met the sky. And so the divide between teacher and pupil deepened. Aristotle, still in Macedonia, heard of Alexander's growing claims of divinity, his adoption of Persian customs, his insistence that men bow before him as before a god. To the philosopher, rooted in reason, this was dangerous arrogance. To Alexander, it was destiny. Here lies the paradox. Aristotle had taught Alexander to admire Homer's heroes, especially Achilles. Yet in Achilles, Alexander saw not moderation, but glory, vengeance, immortality through deeds. If Aristotle had hoped his pupil would embrace reason, Alexander instead embraced myth. He carried Aristotle's annotated copy of the Iliad, but he wielded it like a prophecy, not a lesson. He believed he was Achilles reborn, and Achilles had never been moderate. Still, the influence of Aristotle remained visible. As Alexander conquered city after city, he did not simply destroy. He founded new ones, most famously Alexandria in Egypt. These cities were not only military outposts but cultural beacons, centers of learning, trade, and knowledge. Libraries, theaters, schools, all hallmarks of the philosophical tradition. This was no accident. This was the mark of a man shaped by Aristotle's vision of knowledge as power. Yet the philosopher would not have recognized his own teachings in full. Aristotle taught the superiority of Greeks over non-Greeks, the sharp division between Hellenes and barbarians. Alexander, however, began to blur that line. He encouraged marriages between his men and Persian women, dressed in Eastern robes, and fused Greek and Persian traditions into one. Was this tolerance born of Aristotle's universal curiosity, or was it rebellion against his master's narrow definitions? Perhaps both. For Alexander was no mere student repeating lessons. He was a creator, a transformer, taking fragments of Aristotle's wisdom and forging them into his own worldview. In this sense, he was philosopher and conqueror in one, an empire builder of ideas as much as of armies. But cracks soon began to appear. The further Alexander marched, the more ruthless he became. Friends executed, generals doubted, conspiracies crushed in blood. His paranoia deepened, his temper flared. Was this the rational leader Aristotle envisioned, or a tyrant losing control? One of the darkest moments came with the death of Clitus, a trusted officer who had once saved Alexander's life. During a drunken argument, Clitus criticized Alexander's adoption of Persian customs, warning him he was betraying his Greek roots. In a fit of rage, Alexander killed him with his own spear. The king who once learned philosophy under Aristotle now stood weeping over the body of his friend, horrified by his own loss of control. Here, the lesson of moderation, Aristotle's central teaching, had been utterly abandoned. Yet even in this tragedy the philosopher's shadow lingered. Alexander mourned not just the death of Clytus, but the death of balance within himself. He knew he had crossed a line. Did he remember Aristotle's warnings in that moment? Did the voice of his teacher echo in his mind, whispering of reason, restraint, and the dangers of hubris? We cannot know. But history shows us a man increasingly torn between the philosopher's wisdom and the conqueror's hunger. And so the campaigns continued, into the heart of Asia, into lands Aristotle himself had only dreamed of describing. The philosopher had taught Alexander about geography, about the wonders of the world beyond Greece. Now Alexander saw them with his own eyes. The vast plains of Mesopotamia, the palaces of Persia, the mysteries of Egypt, the rivers of India. He carried not only soldiers but scholars, cartographers, naturalists. Each conquest was not only a victory for his armies but an expansion of human knowledge. In this Aristotle's influence burned bright. But knowledge alone could not restrain ambition. At the Hydaspes River in India, Alexander faced King Porus, a ruler commanding elephants that shook the earth. The battle was fierce, bloody, and unlike anything the Macedonians had ever seen. Yet Alexander's strategy prevailed once more. Porus, defeated but dignified, was spared by Alexander and treated as a valued ally. Was this mercy Aristotle's teaching of ethics, or was it Alexander's own instinct to win loyalty through honor? Perhaps both. Still, exhaustion gnawed at his men. They had marched thousands of miles, fought countless battles, and now at the edge of the world they refused to go further. Alexander wept. Not for defeat, he had not been defeated, but because there were no more worlds to conquer. In that moment, the tension between student and teacher reached its peak. Aristotle had taught him the pursuit of knowledge. Alexander had taken that pursuit to its extreme, seeking not just knowledge but dominion over all existence. And so, the question lingers, did Aristotle truly shape the conqueror, or did Alexander reshape the lessons to fit his boundless ambition? Was the philosopher the architect of empire, or merely the spark that lit a fire too great to control? The cracks in the empire. Victory can be the sharpest poison. For Alexander, triumph had come so swiftly, so relentlessly, that he began to see himself not as a man, but as something greater, untouchable, invincible, perhaps even divine. He had broken Persia. He had marched into India. He had stood where no Greek king had ever stood. And yet, within the glory, shadows began to grow. His men, those hardened Macedonian veterans who had followed him across deserts and rivers, were weary. They had given their youth, their blood, their very lives to feed Alexander's hunger for conquest. And now, in India they reached their breaking point. They refused to march further east. They longed for home, for Macedonia, for the lives they had left behind. But Alexander was not ready to stop. To him, stopping meant defeat, not of arms but of destiny. He raged, he pleaded, he threatened, but his army stood firm. For the first time Alexander's will bent before the will of others. The man who had conquered kings and shattered empires was forced to turn back, his dream of reaching the world's edge unfinished. In that moment we must ask, did he remember Aristotle's lessons? The philosopher had taught moderation, the acceptance of limits, the wisdom of knowing when enough is enough. But Alexander had never been able to accept boundaries. The clash between reason and ambition was now tearing him apart. As the army returned westward, the cracks widened. In Babylon, in Susa, in Persepolis, Alexander's court swelled with pomp and ritual. He adopted Persian customs, robes of silk, jeweled crowns, ceremonies of divine kingship. He demanded that his men bow before him, performing the ritual of proskynesis, once reserved for gods. To many Macedonians this was betrayal. They had followed Alexander, the warrior king, the son of Philip. Now they saw a man who no longer resembled them, a king draped in foreign customs, declaring himself son of Zeus Ammon. Was this truly Aristotle's student, the boy of reason and philosophy? Or had he become intoxicated with power, reshaping himself into a figure beyond human restraint? The tension boiled over in tragedy. Clytus the Black, one of Alexander's most loyal officers, spoke openly against these new customs. In a drunken quarrel, he accused Alexander of forgetting his Macedonian roots, of dishonoring the men who had fought beside him. The words stung deeply. Alexander, consumed by rage, struck him down with a spear. The room fell silent. A friend who had once saved his life now lay dead at his hands. In the silence after, Alexander wept. He locked himself away for days, consumed with grief and guilt. And here, perhaps, the ghost of Aristotle returned. For had not the philosopher warned of the dangers of unrestrained passion? Of the destruction that comes when anger overwhelms reason? In that dark chamber, did Alexander hear his teacher's voice, whispering of moderation, of balance, of restraint? Or was it too late, the conqueror already lost to his own fire? The killings did not end there. Paranoia seeped into Alexander's soul. Conspiracies, real and imagined, haunted him. Men who once shared his table now faced execution. Even Callisthenes, a historian and Aristotle's own relative, fell victim. He had resisted Alexander's demand for proskynesis, standing firm against treating a man as a god. For his defiance he was accused of treason and put to death. It was not just an execution. It was a symbolic severing of ties with his teacher, a rejection of Aristotle's reason in favor of divine ambition. Yet in other ways Aristotle's influence still burned bright. For even as Alexander drifted into godlike visions of himself, he never abandoned the pursuit of knowledge. He sent explorers to map rivers and mountains. He ordered catalogues of plants and animals unknown to Greece. He interrogated local scholars about customs, languages, and beliefs. He may have abandoned moderation, but he had not abandoned curiosity. The philosopher's spark remained, even as the conqueror's fire consumed him. But destiny is not patient. In 323 BCE in Babylon, Alexander's body began to fail. Fever struck him down, though whether by illness, poison, or exhaustion, no one knows for certain. He lay upon his deathbed, surrounded by generals, his empire stretching from Greece to India, yet fragile as glass. What thoughts filled his mind in those final days? Did he remember the boy he once was, sitting at Aristotle's side, listening to lessons of logic and ethics? Did he regret the blood spilled, the friends lost, the empire too vast to hold? Or did he believe, even as his body withered, that he had achieved immortality, that he had surpassed even the lessons of philosophy by carving his name into eternity? When asked who would inherit his empire, Alexander's answer was chilling: to the strongest. With those words he left behind not order but chaos. The great empire fractured, torn apart by his generals and wars that would last generations. His dream of unity dissolved into bloodshed. And so, the final question emerges. If Aristotle truly shaped Alexander, why did his legacy end in such ruin? Did the conqueror fail to follow the philosopher's wisdom, or was the philosopher's wisdom never enough to contain such a spirit? Legacy, the philosopher and the conqueror. History remembers the clash of armies, the roar of battle, the fall of empires. But when the dust settles, when swords rust and empires crumble, what remains is something far more elusive: legacy. And here, the story of Alexander and Aristotle reaches its most profound question. Alexander died young, only 32 years old, yet by then he had carved an empire spanning 3 continents. Cities bore his name. Cultures blended under his command. He had achieved what no general before him had even dared to dream. But his empire, vast as it was, did not survive him. Within a generation it was fractured, divided among his generals, its unity lost to ambition and civil war. What then was Alexander's true legacy? Was it empire or was it something more subtle? Look closer, and you will see the fingerprints of Aristotle woven into the fabric of Alexander's conquests. For Alexander did not simply spread his rule, he spread ideas. He built cities that became centers of knowledge. He encouraged the blending of cultures, creating a new world where East and West collided and merged. This process, later called Hellenization, carried Greek language, philosophy, science, and art across lands that had never known them before. And where did those philosophies come from? They traced back to Athens, to Plato, to Socrates, and to Aristotle. The student carried the teacher's torch, even if he often ignored the teacher's warnings. Without Alexander's conquests, Aristotle's works might have remained confined to Greece, their influence limited. But through Alexander they spread to Egypt, to Mesopotamia, to lands that would carry them forward into the future. Consider Alexandria in Egypt, one of Alexander's most enduring foundations. Long after his death, it became home to the Great Library, a repository of knowledge from across the known world. Philosophy, science, medicine, mathematics, all gathered under one roof, scholars working side by side, debating, discovering, creating. This library stood as a living monument not only to Alexander's vision but also to Aristotle's teachings. For it was knowledge, not conquest, that ultimately endured. Yet the irony cannot be ignored. Aristotle had warned against excess, against hubris, against the temptation of godlike ambition. And Alexander had embraced all of these, claiming divinity, demanding worship, pushing beyond all limits. In doing so, he betrayed the very heart of his teacher's philosophy. But at the same time, it was this unrestrained ambition that spread Aristotle's name across the world. The conqueror and the philosopher were bound together in paradox. One provided the wisdom, the other the stage upon which it could echo. And so we must ask, who truly won the battle of legacy? On one side, Alexander, the warrior who reshaped the world in less than 2 decades. His name is still remembered, his battles still studied, his legend still whispered. He proved that a single life, burning bright and brief, could alter the course of nations. But his empire died with him. On the other side, Aristotle, the thinker whose words outlived kings. His philosophy shaped not only Alexander but centuries of rulers, scientists, theologians, and scholars. From the Islamic Golden Age to the Renaissance, from medieval universities to modern classrooms, Aristotle's voice echoes still. His empire was not of land but of thought, and unlike Alexander's, it never crumbled. And yet, can we separate them so easily? Without Alexander, would Aristotle's wisdom have traveled so far, so fast? Without Aristotle, would Alexander have had the tools to conquer, to strategize, to envision something greater than mere war? The student and the teacher, bound in a strange dance, each amplifying the other, even in opposition. Their relationship was never simple. At times, Alexander followed Aristotle's wisdom with precision, studying geography, applying logic to strategy, spreading Greek culture. At other times, he defied him completely, claiming divinity, drowning in excess, killing those who opposed him. But perhaps that is the point. The mark of a true teacher is not to create a mirror of oneself, but to ignite something greater. Aristotle lit the fire, and Alexander turned it into a blaze that consumed the world. And here lies the final twist. History is not shaped by warriors alone, nor by philosophers alone. It is shaped when the two collide. Ideas without power remain whispers in the wind. Power without ideas burns out in chaos. But together, ideas carried by power and power guided, however imperfectly, by ideas, they change the course of humanity. Alexander and Aristotle were not rivals, nor were they simply teacher and student. They were two forces of history, their legacies intertwined, their influence inseparable. The conqueror needed the philosopher. The philosopher needed the conqueror. And together they left behind a world forever altered. So, who truly changed history more? Was it Alexander with his armies, his cities, his endless hunger for conquest? Or was it Aristotle with his words, his logic, his pursuit of truth? The answer may depend not on history but on how you see the world today. If you believe that strength, ambition, and power shape destiny, then Alexander was the true architect of the age. But if you believe that ideas, knowledge, and wisdom endure long after empires fall, then it was Aristotle who truly reigned. Perhaps the truth is this: Alexander gave the world the stage but Aristotle gave it the script. One carved the map, the other filled it with meaning. And together they remind us that the battle between power and philosophy is not ancient history, it is a struggle that defines every age, including our own. And so, we end where we began, with a question. What matters more, the sword that conquers or the mind that endures? The answer is not simple. But one thing is certain: without the philosopher, the conqueror's empire would have been forgotten. And without the conqueror, the philosopher's words might never have reached us. 2 men. 2 legacies. 1 world forever changed. And now the question is yours. Who do you believe truly held the greater power, Alexander the Great or Aristotle the Wise?